This week we're going to look at Chapter 7, that is the role that family life plays in human behavior. And I think we can do this in one lecture. So, first of all, we have to look at families and some different definitions of family and some kind of basic concepts regarding the family system. And one of them is how is families formed. And the text talks about three different ways that I think generally is accepted as the ways families begin. One, of course, biologically through blood and genetics, legally when one marries or adopts, and socially when, well, depends upon your definition of family. Perhaps when people moved in together, this is called the chosen family, or what we call fictive kin, which are those who are treated like aunts and uncles and cousins, but really are not biologically or legally related. So, biological, legal, and social origins to the family system. How the family is defined, we're going to look at the next slide at a variety of definitions of family life, but for the textbook, they refer to a family as a social group of two or more persons characterized by ongoing interdependence with long-term commitments that stem from blood, law, or affection. That's fairly comprehensive and also inclusive definition, I think, and is one that I think for the most part I accept as a good definition for the family. There are some terms regarding family life that you should be familiar with because you run into this a lot in readings, and you're probably already familiar, but if not, monogamy, of course, is when there's one spouse or I guess one romantic partner if individuals are living together in a social arrangement. That's a monogamous relationship, one spouse at a time. A polygamous relationship, there is more than one spouse at a time, and legally speaking, across the United States, that's not legal. But there are I think, some isolated communities where polygamy is practiced, to the consternation of the legal authorities. And polygamy can either be polygyny, which is one male with several wives, or polyandry, which is one woman with several males. Now, different cultures around the world, I think actually polygamy is, I think the textbook points out that polygamy is a lot more popular around the world than it is in Western culture. And then in terms of how we pair up, how we choose our partner, let's say our mate, there are a couple different terms that are a little more obscure. One's exogamy and the other endogamy. And you can see in an exogamous relationship, we look for our mate, let's say, outside of our particular group. In an endogamous relationship, we look for mates within our group. So what do we have in America? It's a combination of the two. Generally speaking, at least, so endogamous relationships. Now, again, these things become probably less important than they were at one time, but endogamous relationships were important, for instance, with people who were concerned about marrying within one's church, those kinds of things. And exogamous, not marrying within one's family, for instance, because of, theoretically because of potential genetic concerns and those kinds of things. It's just one example of endogamy and exogamy. And really, American relationships are a combination of the two. American marriages, I should say. Here's a slide and this is in the text, different definitions. And some of these definitions of family, I think, probably don't include all the kinds of arrangements that we accept as family these days. At least the majority of people do. Some of them are very broad and can accept almost any kind of arrangement, like Leader's definition, a group of people who have intimate social relationships and have a history together. That could be, a large group of single persons that have shared a house and stay together for 4 or 5 years, and perhaps that they should be considered a family. But in the traditional definition of the term, that would not certainly fall into that category. The Seacom and Warner definition is the one that seems to fit most closely with what the authors have have chosen, which is a relationship by blood, marriage, or affection, in which members, I like how they say, may cooperate economically, may care for any children, and may consider identity to be intimately connected to a larger group. Usually the definition I have is that they do those things, and the may, well, I'm not quite sure what they're implying. I guess that means sometimes people just don't share their economics, when they're married. I guess that's true. But it seems to take in, I think, every possible kind of combination that we see as family, including cohabiting couples, people that haven't legally married, which would be actually, curiously, would be excluded by the U.S. Census Bureau, where it says it's a group of two or more people who reside together and who are related by birth, marriage, or adoption. Couples that have lived together for 20 years would not be included in that particular definition. So that's why I think the Seacom and Warner definition, and also the definition that this author has chosen, seems to be the most inclusive and appropriate. Historically speaking, the definition of family and what families do really has changed and altered over the years. We go back to before the first European incursion into the continent. There were over 2,000 cultures with different customs and lifestyles, and different definitions, presumably, of what a family is before Europeans ever arrived. And then the European settlers from Europe arrived in four different waves from the 1600s through the beginning, or through the time that the Civil or the Revolutionary War began. And each of those waves, each of those groups had different customs, practices, and attitudes about family and marriages and relationships. Now, after the nation had been established, the Industrial Revolution had occurred in I think the first half of the 1800s is when it began, and a lot of things changed during that period of time. And one of the things that changed, the Industrial Revolution, being a social revolution, changes not only the way we buy products, but it changes everything. That's what a social revolution is. So among those things that are changed are the nature of family relationships. And when prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had primarily an agricultural economy, and generally speaking, most of the work was done from the home. Family produced their own goods, more or less, and didn't rely upon other people for work. The man was the head of the household, and although the woman oftentimes participated equally in the work producing food and tending to the animals and everything like that, nonetheless, in the old family system, the male was considered to be the head of the household. And the children also participated in the work. That's one of the reasons why large families were seen as beneficial in those days, because that, generally speaking, that meant that there were more people to share the load of the work and those kinds of things. So families tended to be larger in those days. When the Industrial Revolution comes along, much changes, and instead of growing and making our own goods, now we have begun to purchase goods, and instead of earning our own way and providing for the family directly, the adults in the family have begun to work for other people. And primarily, this is when the separate spheres for men and women began to develop, women being, primarily those who took care of the home, men being the ones who did all the stuff outside the home. This is when that all began, for the most part, in the United States. And so during this period of time then, men became dependent upon somebody else for their ability to provide for the family. In other words, you go to your boss for your paycheck, and this was new to men in that era. And many people, I know from the men and masculinity class that I've taught over the years, this was one of those periods of times when the definition of masculinity really changed, because no longer was the individual male totally independent and responsible for his family, but now he depended upon another person to provide for his family. And there are those who say that this really changed a lot about maleness in the 1800s. Maybe you've, this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but there was a book out some years ago, and there's been this sort of this thread of speculation since that time that Abraham Lincoln might have been bisexual or homosexual even, and they cite examples of him having his male friends from his youth over to the White House when Mary was away, or in fact sharing a bed with one of his male friends before he got married, and this was not uncharacteristic of males in those days, particularly also because of the fact that well, economics often required that you shared, and it was the case in Lincoln's history, that he share a living space. And I don't know that 2 bedrooms or 2 beds were really affordable. But beyond that, males were allowed to express more affection. I'm not talking about sexual interactions, but men were able to express affection, give each other hugs, and really touch each other in ways that nowadays, men don't do. And this all changed in the 1800s, and some think because of this change in the definition of masculinity, because of becoming dependent upon other males, to be able to provide for the home, men had to find other ways to seem very masculine, and so the affectionate side was pushed away, and what came in its place were more organized sports. So you see team sports like, I don't know when football started, but baseball started in the 1800s, and those kinds of things. And so team sports and clubs, men's organizations became popular in the late 1800s and sort of took the place of affectionate bonds. Just kind of an interesting little aside. I think interestingly also, the late 1800s is around the period of time when we first began to decipher between homosexuality and heterosexuality. It really wasn't, it wasn't a thing before the late 1800s, and became kind of more important to people around the turn of the last century. Again, many think because of this change with the Industrial Revolution. So the family changed, of course, with this as well. And so instead of the family all working together to produce the goods, and children being able to participate in work with their parent, those kinds of things, now work was done away from the home. Parents were away from their children during that time, and with the exception of lower class women, many of whom went off to work in factories and lived in dormitories, that kind of thing. For the most part, it was the men who went outside the home. So the men were the wage earners. The men were the ones who would participate. It was legitimate for them to participate in politics, those kinds of things. Women were to be taking care of the family. Now, when we talk about the ideal family, this is the mother and father and 2.3 kids or whatever. This really kind of comes out of the 1950s, and nowadays when people, these family theorists, bemoan the loss of the family unit or the institution of the family, how it's changed so much and everything, they always kind of point to the Cleavers and Father Knows Best and those kinds of families, when in fact this was an aberration. This ideal family really was an aberration that existed for the most part in the 50s, and even then really wasn't that pervasive all in all. But in any event, another thing that happened with the family is that it was, instead of being the source of work and everything, now it was a retreat from the workplace. It was a place for emotional support and guidance by parents and those kinds of things. In the 60s, I believe that what really caused the social revolution, and it's often been overlooked by sociologists, I think, is the advent of the pill, becoming available. It changed a lot about male and female relationships and sexuality, certainly, but also basic things about male and female relationships. And gender roles began to change in the 1960s, and many women went out into the workforce. So this again changed the makeup of the families. And so oftentimes now there were two parents, the mother wasn't staying at home. I'm backtracking a little. I don't mean to get too off track here, but during World War II, with many of the income-producing males, so to speak, overseas fighting in the war. Factories turned to women to work. Rosie the Riveter, and such individuals to produce the goods that were needed to keep families functioning, to keep the war machine, in products and such. And so when the war was over and all those veterans came back from overseas, we needed jobs for those men. We couldn't have men not working and women working. And so, although certain things were done, like the GI Bill and different kinds of things to get a lot of those men into colleges and give them time to find work, another thing was there was a lot of pressure put on women to leave the workplace, and women had discovered that they could function without males in their lives, and they were not always so eager to give up their jobs. So the pressure was put on women to leave the workforce and let those jobs open up for men. And in the 1950s, Freudian psychology became very, very popular, and there was this sense that, well, first of all, that a lot of the problems that we had to do with our unsatisfactory relationships with our mothers growing up. This sometimes explained homosexuality. There were people who believed that the increase in juvenile delinquency during the 1950s had to do with working mothers, those kinds of things. So, as is often the case, women were blamed for the society's ills, and so there was a lot of social pressure put on them to return to the home and be at home. But by the 60s, there was, I don't know, I wouldn't say it was a backlash, but it was more of a continuation of that gender revolution, gender role revolution that occurred during, well, really before then, but certainly occurred during World War II. And women began to establish themselves as establish some sense of equality. We're still quite a bit a ways from equality and gender equality in the workforce and other places, but nonetheless, this movement began, or really intensified, during the 1960s. Now, the textbook looks at 5 different perspectives for understanding the family: and psychodynamic family systems, a feminist perspective, family stress and coping, and family resilience. And we're going to go through a few slides to just kind of talk a little bit about each of those. Psychodynamic perspective, of course, there's always an emphasis on unconscious processes and things that are going on below the surface that we're really not aware of all of the time, or aware of at all, for that matter. And the psychodynamic perspective in family work posits that unresolved problems in one's family of origin, that is, the family from whence you came, is the source of current personal and interpersonal problems in the family. So you look back to the previous generation and how you interacted with your parents, and perhaps how they interacted with their parents, understand what's going on. And any issues that were left unresolved in the families of origin then are acted out in current intimate relationships, including the family. Murray Bowen is, and I'm not quite sure why he himself is identified here. I mean, there's so many other theorists that might be mentioned here, but Bowen's concept of the differentiation of self is mentioned in the textbook, and he emphasized the need for an individual to differentiate, individuals within a family system to be able to differentiate between thinking and feeling. That at times when the situation calls for clear thinking, rationality, and those kinds of things, that we tend to react emotionally, rather than rationally and thoughtfully. And so it was important for individuals in a family system to be able to differentiate the emotional responses and the intellectual awarenesses in dealing with crises and those kinds of things. And he also talked about the differentiation of self. This is a term that, for adolescents at least, that I have was familiar with, called individuation. This idea that individuals in a family system should follow their own beliefs rather than making decisions that are a reaction to others' expectations of them and the need for the others' approval. Now, it seems to me that, and I don't mean to contest what Murray Bowen is saying, because certainly, clearly that makes a lot of sense to me. But it also seems to me that a family system might be terribly strained if everybody kind of went their own way and didn't really care so much about what other people wanted. I mean, we want the approval of others in our families, right? And so we can't just divorce ourselves from that if we're going to, I think, at least, if we're going to have a fully functioning family. But what Bowen is saying is, I think, is not to let that go to extreme, but to to know oneself and to act sometimes on what you believe rather than what might win the favor of other people in the family. He also, I think, is most associated with the term triangulation, although it's something that is a common term in family therapy, where basically, well, the definition of triangulation is the two-person emotional system inappropriately forms itself into a three-person system or triangle when under stress. And so, the classic example of this is the acting out adolescent, who's brought to therapy by his mother and father. And he has some particular behavior problem that they're very focused upon helping this child to overcome, and so they bring him into therapy, and the therapist kind of, I don't know, does the work that needs to be done. The kid pulls himself together. Not that that happens so easily, don't get me wrong, but somehow the behavior begins to remit the problem behavior, and things begin to look good, and all of a sudden then the marriage falls apart. And that's the theory here is that the parents, have been avoiding dealing with their own relationship issues by triangulating or focusing upon the child, and the child is unwittingly willing to sacrifice himself to preserve the parents' marriage, and he does that by acting out. So that's a simplified explanation of triangulation. And Bowen certainly isn't the only person who uses that particular theory in working with families by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very popular way of seeing things. The genogram is mentioned. I don't think this is Bowen's invention, but somehow it comes up in this conversation. And I'm sure you're all familiar with genograms. It's a visual representation of a family's composition and structure. Now, the interesting thing, and this is an example of from the family that is mentioned, I think, at the beginning of the chapter, the Sharp family. Now, the interesting women are circles, men are squares, and you see the particular definitions now. So genograms have been used for a lot of different things over the years, and I have they can be a very powerful tool. I have seen, for instance, in the family therapy class that I took in my master's training, one of the family therapy courses, we constructed genograms, and we placed an emphasis upon names, as if I remember correctly, in doing our genogram. And so we looked for other people in our history that might have had the same name. And for instance, myself, my name is my first and middle name is my grandfather. My William Foster is my maternal grandfather is William Foster. Also my uncle, also my cousin. My uncle's oldest daughter married another William. I don't know that the next generation had any Williams. I think we've all kind of tired of the name, but what he did was have us search for similarities between individuals, and how we did that was by with the circle or the square was inserting what the family said about the person. He was a good guy, or he was a hard worker, or he was a real black sheep, or whatever, those kinds of things. And I didn't particularly find any revelations for my own name, but my family therapy instructor felt that names have a lot to do and carry it. And I think if you think back, you might see that's true. The idea being that parents who name their child after somebody in an earlier generation, or even their own generation, somehow shape the behavior and adjustment of that child to reflect what they know about that other person. It's almost like their expectations. So that's the kind of thing you can do with a genogram. I've seen this used with in treatment of alcoholism and drug addiction, where people go back and search out the other addicts and alcoholics in the family and those kinds of things. You can kind of do a genogram for almost any purpose when you're trying to understand how things come down through a family system, and it's a very powerful tool. Can be very powerful, and if you haven't ever used them, I encourage you to try it out sometime when you're working with a family and get yourself a book or two on genograms and get more familiar with them. I had I did a 200 level sociology course at KPC a number of times over the years, and I don't remember that there's any particular goal that I gave my students in doing this, but had my students in an introductory marriage and family course to as an option, as an alternative to doing a research paper, because I didn't think everybody wanted to do this, that they were ready for this. Have them, those who chose to could do a family genogram, and those who did it really got into it heavily. And one of the things that was very interesting is that it got my students talking with people, their aunts and uncles, their parents or grandparents, about the family history and about the family. And not only did they learn a lot about the family, but in many cases, some of those persons made contact with members of their family that they hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them had conflicted relationships and they worked past that. Others didn't have conflicted relationships, but just had been out of touch. And so in and of itself, the process of putting this genogram together had a very powerful influence or a powerful effect on my students. So think about what that can do in a therapeutic relationship. It's really a very powerful tool. A family systems perspectives, I think frankly, and Bowen, I think has, as to me has also been, if I remember correctly, I learned about Murray Bowen in my family systems class. Could be wrong about that, but family systems perspective certainly also makes use of genograms quite a bit, and and you can understand why, I think, when you think of the concept of the genogram. And so the focus and again, this is another way you can look at the relationships between men and women, or between parents and children, or between siblings as you go back through a genogram, and see how patterns in the family may indeed be handed down from generation to generation, which is the psychodynamic theory, right? So you identify those patterns, then you can change them. But if you don't know they're there, you can't change them. So again, you see where the genogram fits in this, I think. In family systems perspective, the focus is on the relationships in the family system rather than on the individual. So any individual having problems, such as that acting out adolescent, are part of overall patterns of roles and interactions, and isn't somebody who's necessarily disturbed or deficient or deviant in their own way. And families, one thing about a family system that makes it a system is that there are boundaries around the family. Now, boundaries can be diffuse, is the term really I was looking at, as diffused, or it can be very closed. They're permeable or they're not. Permeable boundaries allow other people in. Now, it depends on how permeable, how diffuse those boundaries are. Boundaries can be so diffused that there's almost no boundary, and that may not be healthy for a family system. By the same token, family systems that are closed don't allow any influences, others to come into, bring ideas into the family at all. And this is often what you'll find about the disturbed families you encounter in your work. Families where there's domestic violence and child abuse and those kinds of things oftentimes have very closed boundaries, and for very clear reasons. They don't want what's going on in that system to be communicated outside. Sexual abuse, what we used to call incest families, same kind of a situation there. And so boundaries that delineate who the family is, and also boundaries within the family define subsystems. So a healthy family system would have permeable but perhaps strong boundaries between the parent and the children in the family. The parent isn't a sibling. The parent, this is going to depend upon how you view parenting, but I mean, most people believe the parent should have a role that is different from being a friend. It's certainly, but but um, but the parental subsystem should allow input from the sibling subsystem, and the sibling subsystem should be getting information, guidance, whatever it might be, from the parental subsystem, and an emotional interaction between the two, right? So in a closed system, you can see where the parents are distant and unfeeling and really very detached from their children. That is a very, very cold and unfriendly family to grow up in, if you can imagine. So families without boundaries between parents and children, you've got mothers who are complaining to their daughters about their sex life with their husbands and things like that. I mean, all those kind of things that most of us might consider to be rather icky, would go on if there aren't clear boundaries between parents and children. And so a certain amount of boundaries are good for a family. A certain amount of boundaries are good within families is all. Permeability to an appropriate extent is something that I think signifies a healthy and long-lasting system. If you take a systems theory class, they'll tell you that any system has to get new information, has to get new input, or it will calcify and die. And so to keep a family system healthy, it's good to have input. As a therapist, as a social worker who's working with a family in a therapeutic relationship or whatever kind, you're crossing the family boundaries into the family system. And so you are some of that outside input. That's how you fit in that picture. So again here, the theory is changing the patterns of interaction between and among family members will address the problem of whatever it is that the individual brought to the family for our attention. So that acting out adolescent, yeah, he's or she is engaging in behaviors that are very troubling and concerning. But in family systems theory, the resolution to that isn't in changing the child, it's in changing that child's interactions with others in the family. This has also been used in families with alcoholics and drug addicts. That in essence the family has this. Well, I had a supervisor one time that referred to this pattern of interaction as a dance, and so he would talk about the dance that other family members had around the dad's drinking, let's say, that allowed the father to drink and to drink too much and those kinds of things. And so for the alcoholic, one of the reasons why ACOA groups, or not ACOA groups, but Alateen groups and the name of the group that the spouses attend is escaping me, but those other groups in treatment of alcoholics is very important because, in a sense, the other individuals in the family, according to this theory, would need to look at their own patterns of behaviors that support the alcoholism, and that if they don't do that, the treatment is doomed. Multi-level family practice widens the focus to include the larger systems in which the family system is embedded, and that would include probably the extended family system, the neighborhood, and there's that you in there. These slides were put together by a Brit, or maybe a Canadian. I have to keep taking the U's out of these words when I put these slides together. The community, as well as you go on up the state, the nation, all these kinds of larger entities whose policies impact the family. So this suggests multi-level family practice suggests that our role is both in terms of the treatment of individuals and family systems, as well as the larger macro role. This is why social work is never boring. It's just you can address problems from any level you want. Now this talks about the family eco map, and you're familiar with the eco map from our discussion of the person and environment and the different levels of systems that surround the family. So you can use eco map to assess how a family connects to the larger systems in its life as well. The feminist perspective in any setting really considers patterns of dominance and subjugation and oppression. And so this is here, it applies directly to family and family interactions. It sees gender as the primary characteristic in which power is distributed and oftentimes misused in the family system, and addresses, a lot of questions like, how is it that society comes to assign male and female characteristics as it does? That I refer to as those traditional um, social masculine and feminine socialization patterns, where men are sexual and men are aggressive and men are competitive and those kinds of things, and physical, whereas females, again, I'm talking about traditional feminine socialization, are more passive and more accepting, and and nurturing and cooperative, those kinds of things. Now, these are gender roles, gender patterns of behavior that are assigned from our society. They're not innate, although there is some debate about some of that, maybe biological. But personally, I think, you know. 95% of it is socially assigned, and so a feminist is going to look at how it is that this happens and what can we do to alter that, and what are the implications of that. For instance, it tends to put men in charge as the head of the household, and those kinds of things, which in the long run, when you combine that with aggression and sexuality, can set up all sorts of negative interactions between the spouses and also including the children. And mind you, because we teach our children to listen to their father and their mother, we're really teaching the next generation the same kind of power arrangements. So say some sociological thinkers, and I think it's something to consider. Now, I don't know what the alternative is. I do know what the alternative is, but how to do that, I'm not really clear yet. So that's something for one of you to explore if you want to do some research in your career. How do family practices create advantages and disadvantages? Um, what about caregiving responsibilities? Women are the ones that are, of course, are assigned to that, which underlies a lot of the fact that they're underpaid in the workforce because they leave the workforce more frequently than men to care for kids on a day-to-day basis, as well as, on a longer-term basis. Um, and the family is seen as the site of both love and trauma, as I think I was just implying. Now, intersectionality also comes up in this, and I think, touched on this in another chapter as well. That it is not just one's gender, but other kinds of things impact women even more, so that that being a black female, for instance, or being an elderly female, or being a lesbian, those kinds of things, having belonging to other minority groups can increase the the oppression that a woman experiences. Likewise, the privilege, so that if one is a female but one is Caucasian, that may lessen the impact of oppression in the family system. Here in the family stress and coping perspective, this really puts you in mind a little bit of a CPT model of treatment, which is separates the activating event from the thoughts and the reactions, right? Well, here you're in a family system, family stress and coping, what you're looking at is the event A in the family system and what makes it become a crisis, which is X. So that in order to understand this, you have to look at the family's resources, B, and the family's definitions of the event, C. So again, it's very, very similar to the ABC model with rational emotive therapy and other cognitive behavioral interventions. So the impact of stressors in a family are influenced by other factors like resources and also the meaning that we assign to the stressor. So families can see stressors as something that is going to tear them apart totally, or it can be something that helps them to pull together and marshal their resources. It's in my career, and I bet you encounter this as well, that one of the things I've noticed is that some of the families that have the most problems internally find themselves serviced positively in their relationships by an outside threat. So let a child protection worker step into a home where there is constant conflict, particularly in regards to abuse of children, for instance, something like that. And you'll see the family kind of circle the wagons is sort of the good explanation for that, including the children. And they may have problems with each other, but they're not going to let anybody come in and threaten the existence of their family or tell them how to run their family, those kinds of things. Here, although stresses are not handled well by the system in general, here's a situation where the family defines the event as something that they need to defend themselves against, and so they pull their resources together. Now, that's not necessarily a positive example, but there are positive examples of this as well, where a family sees a challenge, not a threat, from an outside stressor, and work together to meet the challenge. So, following a stressful event, there is a period of disequilibrium. What the word is stasis, which is equilibrium, and a family is upset by a stressor, and so following that stressor and its resolution, one of three things can happen. The family may recover to its previous level of functioning. It may go through a period of maladaptation, which is really, this says a permanent deterioration in functioning. I think there can be temporary periods of maladaptation. I don't think it has to be a permanent deterioration, but the permanent deteriorations may occur, oftentimes resulting in things like, divorce or abuse, ongoing, those kinds of things. Or a new term, bond adaptation, bond being good, I guess. So it's an improvement in a family's previous functioning. And again, that can be temporary or permanent. But so stressful events can be beneficial at times. And it might help when you're working with a family who is having some issues about stressors, help them see that and help them see what the outcomes that they can choose between. and suggesting to them that it is a choice may empower them. The family stress and coping perspective looks at stress, and there's two different kinds of stress, which are the normative stresses. Those are the things that every family goes through in this life cycle. The marriage, maybe separation because of a deployment, birth of a child, moving to a new home, a change of a job, child leaving home, those kinds of things. Those are what are considered normative stressors, those that we have time to prepare for. And then there are non-normative stressors, and these are ones that, generally speaking, we can't prepare for. Hopefully are one-time or unusual kind of events like unemployment, some sort of medical issue, accidents, catastrophes. Now, in the life of a family, when there's a series of crises, a number of different things happening at one time, the textbook refers to it as stress pileup. These kinds of things can really deplete resources of the family and increase the likelihood of negative outcomes because, the family may not have had the time to kind of think through how they're going to deal with this or to react positively, may feel defeated by the fact that it's one damn thing after another. That type of thought process can be very detrimental, and so stress pileup can really shake a family otherwise stable family system. And it's interesting to point out that lower level but persistent stress, such as chronic illness and poverty and those kinds of things, can create stress pileup as well. So it's been said sometimes, I know in work in child protection over the years, there was some discussion about the fact that when you go into homes and you see a neglectful home, it's not enough to threaten a child's life immediately, but has some negative effects on the child's development. You probably don't make a removal necessarily, but you try to put in services. And many people believe that the ongoing existence of chronic neglect has more damage on the child in the long run than does a single instance of abuse or a couple instances of physical abuse or even sexual abuse. And now that's debatable, but the point is that chronic problems of the lower level can together add up to being a much bigger problem. So the use of a family timeline sometimes can help family both recognize that this is it's an instance of stress pileup, and also look for other such events in the past, and help them kind of talk about those events and figure out what they did in those days. Now this actually has to spread into 2 slides, and I tried to find a way to put these 2 illustrations into 1 slide, and it just didn't work. And so this is again that family that is mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, and you see here all the different kinds of things. It goes back to the time that the children were born, or the parents were born rather, and kind of looks at the different kinds of big events that occur, the stressors, positive and negative, that occurred in the family, and then here's the second half, up to the present day. The family resilience perspective considers the processes that allow a family to bear up and rebound from distress. Not only do families weather stress, but sometimes families come back stronger than ever. That's that bond adaptation that was referred to a slide or 2 back. Families see challenges in stressors and that not potential damage or threats to their existence, and so they have the potential to repair and to grow out of these events, bouncing forward rather than bouncing back. And this theory suggests that family belief systems are one of the reasons why. What meaning do they make of adversity? And you can view this adversity as a positive motivating event or a threatening event. And obviously, the results would be different. Organizational patterns. There are certain ways that families interact and handle stressors that the term is they function as shock absorbers in a family, which of course again that makes a lot of sense. And then the communication processes. Resilient families send consistent, genuine messages to other members, and also an important thing, engage in collaborative problem solving. They get everybody together and to talk about what's going on and ways to resolve things, and that's a positive when they're working together. I once in this marriage and family course, one of the theories about what makes a happy relationship, a happy marriage, one of the things was that the couples are willing to talk about their troubles. Instead of that many couples have a tendency to bury problems and not deal with little things because they don't want to bother anybody, but then there's this pile up of little things that eventually becomes a big thing. So it's sort of like putting a forest fire out when it's still just a little campfire getting a little out of its boundaries. And the couples that confront those issues and that talk about them together and work through them when they're small are going to have a happier relationship in the long run. Now we look at different structures in family life, and I must say this is, in sociology classes it was always the nuclear family and the extended family, and this has really taken the definition of family structures to new extremes for me, and it's okay because actually there, maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, I understand the reason for this. So let's take a look at each of these structures a little bit. First, a nuclear family. It's a worldwide trend in societies that become urbanized and industrialized. The extended family is, speaking ahead here, are more associated with agricultural societies. But in industrialized societies, nuclear families are more of the norm. And in many respects, they're more practical because they're smaller. Remember, individuals are working for other people, dependent upon other people for their wages, and so they have to. It's just useful to be mindful of all of that issue as you build a family. Mobility, for instance, makes you more employable, and so mobility is not so easy. Moving your family is not so easy when you have a whole extended family. Nuclear families have been the preferred model in U.S. history, although, again, I would say this is the case since we've become industrialized, which is fairly early in our history. But the ideal of the nuclear family, the two parent, two children, everybody's happy and meeting each other's needs and things like that, really is very difficult to accomplish. Um, Nuclear families are isolated from other families. Now, some families are good at connecting into the community and with their friends, and I will say that the introduction of the internet and texting and FaceTime and Skype and those kinds of things have really kind of eased that emotional isolation that nuclear families often experience. But nonetheless, you miss that physical direct contact, face-to-face contact that is available in the extended family. And so it puts extra pressure on individuals, and it puts extra pressure on the spousal relationship to meet each other's needs kind of totally. And that's not a healthy thing. So nuclear families in that respect, also economically, they have to meet their own needs and those kinds of things. According to the Census Bureau, 20% of households in 2002 were married couples with children, down from 40% in 1970. And so you can see this ideal is something that is becoming less common in the United States. And it may be something we need to move away from expecting everybody to do. Extended families, the parent-child nuclear family lives along with other relatives, grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. The Amish are a good example of a modern day society that continues to, for the most part, continues to use the extended family system. When a young Amish male marries, he builds onto, traditionally speaking, he builds onto his father's home for his own living space, and his father, by the way, continues to be the head of the household, even though he's now a married male. But this is kind of the extended family system. And like I said, some ethnic groups prefer and there are more kind of informal configurations of the extended family where aunts, uncles, grandparents live very close by, if not in the same home, which I think could qualify as an extended family, even if they're not living together. Perhaps the, specific definition requires people to live together, but I think, the concept is still there. Financially, it helps because there's other resources, other people. You're sharing expenses in many respects. You can turn to others for emotional support. If that acting out adolescent can't relate to his mother and father, maybe he can go to his uncle, or his grandfather or grandmother for a little bit of, somebody who isn't managing his behavior. For a little bit of understanding and emotional support, and somebody who, by the way, has the same kind of values that his parents have. So that's the trouble with going to a counselor, and that's, a lot of individuals who work with troubled kids, that's what you're doing. You're kind of functioning as that uncle when the extended family no longer exists, or aunt. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about myself, that aunt or uncle. So the authors say that our current family is a modified extended family, that even though people don't live together, they're involved with each other in ongoing emotional and economic actions all of the time. And, of all the groups, middle-class white Americans have the weaker extended family ties than most other groups in the United States. Cohabiting, I think that should be cohabitating heterosexual couples. This is one of those categories. I'm not sure why same-sex couples have to be a separate category here. I know that there are certainly some differences, but for the most part, unmarried same-sex couples would seem to fit into this category, and as for that matter, as they would in a nuclear family category. But in any event, they're separated out here in this lecture. Cohabiting means living together, and romantic is, I think, not the term, but that's the term they use here, in a romantic relationship without marriage. You know that our society, this is probably something you've heard many times before, but the fact that our society uses romantic love as the basis for a happy marriage is one of the reasons why our divorce rate is higher, at least so they say. There is a lot of practicality involved. There's arranged marriages sometimes, they certainly rob people of their individuality and everything, but this notion of marrying for romance, romance tends to die out over the years, and when that's gone, there's a lot of disillusionment. Okay, another aside. So, living together in a romantic relationship without marriage, and the rate of unmarried cohabiting partners in the United States has increased dramatically since the 1960s. Probably not a surprise. But globally, we're kind of about in the middle as far as the rates of cohabitation is concerned. The interesting thing, well, it may be seen as a prelude to marriage or as an alternative to marriage. The interesting thing is at least the last time I read up on this, the studies have shown that living together before marriage, in fact, not only does not increase the likelihood your marriage will be successful, but couples who have lived together before marriage actually have a higher divorce rate than those that have not. Interesting. A lot of people think it's because people who live together may not have the same commitment to the institution of marriage itself that people who do not, until they're married, live together have. An interesting little kind of counterintuitive sociological tentative truth for you. Now, because it's easier to live together without being married, the increasing age of first marriage is easily explained. And compared to other Western societies, in Europe, I think most of those cultures, young people don't get married. They get married much later than Americans do. 3 primary motives for cohabiting: spend more time together, share financial burdens, and to test out their compatibility. I think there's probably some other reasons too that aren't mentioned here. Couples with no children over the last 3 decades, the United States and other wealthy nations have had an increase in the proportion of married couples who are childless. Now, one of my textbooks that I've taught out of previously used the term child-free rather than childless, because childless implies that a couple who doesn't have children lacks something, therefore are less because of that, and so childless is probably not a good term. I mean, words are important, right? I mean, and so child-free, which implies that children are a real burden, has been used instead. There should be another word for it. We just don't know what it is just yet. But in any event, in fact, this returns us to trends that were started in the late 19th century up until the 1950s. After World War II, our society, family life became that 2 parents with the white picket fence and 2.2 children and all that, and it was sort of a reaction, I think, a response to the threat that the war cast all over the globe, and the American economy was doing well, and generally speaking, times were pretty good in the 1950s, and we had a lot more children, and so since the advent of the birth control pill, there it is once again. I mean, in the late 50s, early 60s, when it became popularly available, more and more people are choosing not to have children, and because they can, and so there is that voluntary childlessness. There's the involuntary child freeness, or the temporarily childless couples. That is, those that are probably new in their relationship. Infertility is oftentimes the basis for the involuntary childlessness, and can be a source of real stress in a relationship. Although again, the text points out that sometimes the husbands and wives have very different reactions to infertility. I think it's easy to say, and clear to see that childlessness is still got something of a social stigma associated with it. People rather, who choose to not have children, many people consider them being selfish. Lone parent families. What a term this is. It sounds like the origins of some sort of terrorist or mass murderer or something. A lone parent. He was a nice guy, but he was a lone parent. You know, single parent homes seems like a sufficient definition, but it's composed of one parent and at least one child that live in the same household with this parent, headed by either a divorced, widowed, or unmarried parent. In 2012, almost 1 in 3 children live with, as the textbook says, only one parent. Again, that deficiency model. Yes, there are a lot of studies that suggest that two parents are probably a better family system for raising children, but children can grow up very happy with one parent. Excuse me. Most of those children live with a single mother. 1 in 20 of the children out there live with a single father. And as you see, this rate has grown dramatically since 1970s. Now, the issue, of course, with lone parents or single parents is that, particularly for mothers, that they're very vulnerable to economic insecurity and poverty. 51% of single mother homes in the United States live at or below the poverty line, I believe this is, whereas only 8% in Denmark. And in fact, the text points out that Scandinavian homes have a much, their society is much more blended with socialism, even though they're democracies, and so they have a much better support system for families, and so single parents can exist without having poverty nearly as much as in the United States. But there are other Western nations, Germany and Canada were two of them, I believe, that also have a relatively high rate of economic insecurities in single parent homes, although not as high as the United States, the wealthiest nation on earth, supposedly. Issues for the single parent homes is that the single or lone parent has to take on both roles as mother or father. Oh, I guess this is talking about single mother homes, the dual roles of mother and worker with no partner assistance. The same can be true for fathers, of course, but as we know, men earn more and tend to be better established in the work world than women. And oftentimes these parents don't get the kind of child support that they're supposed to get. Interestingly, the text points out that even with child support, single mothers continue to live oftentimes in economic insecure situations. In the United States, our social policy isn't much about supporting families like it might be in Scandinavia, and that's where another interesting source of study for you might be, is to look at those Scandinavian countries, what their policies are about families and economic support, and compare them to the United States. How do they do it? And as I probably said before, and will say again most likely, all the exchange students that I hosted over the years, 8 of them were from Europe, and I never heard any of those students nor any of their parents, most of whom I met and spent quite a bit of time with, never heard any of them complain about the tax burden in their, relatively speaking, their more socialized economy and social system. So instead of supporting families, our policy is about enforcement of child support by the absent parent and encouraging the single parent to get married. Step families become much more complicated than they were in olden days, when usually a step family was formed because one parent died and the surviving parent married another person who took on the step family role, sometimes bringing in other children, sometimes not. Nowadays, step families are usually formed because of a dissolution of a marriage or marriages. And so, a child can find himself or herself in 2 homes, both of which have step parents and step siblings, and it can become very, very complicated for everybody to figure out how to get along in these situations. So, step family is defined as two adults and children where one parent is not the biological parent of at least one of the children in the family. It's kind of a big estimate. Between 10 and 20% of children younger than age 18 reside in step families. I'm not sure why we don't have a more specific percentage there. We do with all the other types of families. But anyway, up to a fifth of the children live in step families, and the family structures have become so much more complex. Children not only are living with somebody they're not related to, or living with people who they're not related to, but they're also hopefully visiting the other parent who may also be bringing in people they're not related to, going back and forth between two different systems, having to make an adjustment each time they go back and forth. Having to adjust to living with children who have grown up in other kinds of environments as well. Step siblings have different expectations of each other. Debates about whether or not the step parent has the right to provide parenting. Having a loyalty to one's biological parent that may conflict with that child's need to bond with the step parent. Sometimes the child expecting their birth parent to be more loyal to them than their spouse, etc., etc. And when the birth parents and or the step families don't get along with each other, and the divorced parents, that becomes even more complicated, and I've seen kids wind up becoming messengers between the two families. And one thing I think is real clear in the cases of children of divorce, and we'll talk about divorce in a bit, children have to be allowed to love both of their parents by both of their parents. They have to be able to feel okay about that. And when they get caught in the middle of disagreements, which they often do in these situations where those parents don't get along or those families don't get along, it becomes very, very stressful for those kids. Not to say, however, that step family life has to be it's probably always difficult, but it can be positive and a challenge, like we had talked about earlier. People like the Brady Bunch, those families, some of them really do exist, maybe not quite as happily as appeared on television, but a lot of people are out there making successful step families. Same-sex partner families. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act enacted during the Clinton administration that required the federal government recognize same-sex marriages from the states where they are legal. Clinton, has come under some assault in other classes by students because he signed the DOMA, but the fact was that there was a big movement afoot. It was a very conservative trend in the mid 90s, not unlike what happened with the Tea Party here, 10 years ago or so. And Clinton recognized that if he didn't sign this Defense of Marriage Act, that essentially said that marriage was between men and women, that the conservatives in Congress were going to push through with a bill to create a constitutional amendment to enshrine it in the Constitution. And so he has said in retrospect, and I believe this is probably the case, because he was a very talented politician. He thought this was better, and so he signed this in order to avoid it becoming enshrined permanently in the Constitution. And so in any event, Supreme Court was able to strike down DOMA in 1996, and the federal government then began to recognize same-sex marriages when individuals were married in certain states. And then in 2015, the court ruled that any bans on same-sex marriage by the states were unconstitutional. So this made same-sex marriages legal in all states. With the current administration, both the president and the vice president, in control with our current Congress, perhaps for the next 4 years, perhaps, for however many terms ahead, the appointments to the courts, the federal courts and the Supreme Courts, are going to be very conservative. And I am concerned that this, among other social causes, may become very threatened if the Supreme Court becomes so conservative that they're willing to overturn these rulings. Overturning Supreme Court rulings has happened in the past, and this is one of those that could happen again. But at the present time, at least, we have legal same-sex marriage in all states. There are more similarities than differences between same-sex marriages, same-sex households, and heterosexual households. But some of the differences, the same-sex partners tend to have less traditional division of labor than heterosexual married couples do. And compared to heterosexual couples, they report less conflict in their relationship than do heterosexual couples. More satisfaction with their relationship and a better ability to resolve conflicts. And in terms of the question of whether children, can grow up to be healthy young adults in such relationships, children who grow up with same-sex parents do not differ in any important way, according to almost all the studies that are out there that are done by unbiased sources, at least. And they're no more likely to identify as homosexual themselves. Military families, another interesting. And again, I understand military families have exceptional and individual stressors. So I guess that's the reason why we're looking at them separately. But they can be involved. They can be a part of any of the other definitions of family life, that family structure that we've just covered. But there certainly are special challenges, particularly in times of deployment, surrounding deployment, I should say. 1/3 of both active duty and reservist members have children. And the spouses of the active duty soldiers and those spouses of reservists all report loneliness and loss of emotional support, role overload, and of course concern and worry about the safety of the deployed spouse when they are deployed, particularly when they're deployed overseas. There are some very important differences, and this is an interesting point that I haven't ever seen mentioned before, but the differences between active duty and reservist families and their experiences. Active duty families tend to live on base or near base, which means that there are economic resources, the base exchange and those kinds of things, as well as emotional support, more readily available to the active duty than to the reservist families. Sometimes the reservist is the only one in his community or her community that is a reserve and is reservist. So when deployed, the remaining spouse and the children don't have the support of other similar families around them readily available to them. Also, all the economic benefits and health benefits that might be available because you live near a base or whatever just aren't there. And so in many respects, the families of reservists, and if I referred to the active duty or reservist as a male, forgive me for this, because they also involve females. In fact, I have a niece who's been deployed to Turkey, and very happily her sister has been able to actually just to move into her home near the military base where she was assigned in the United States, so that her kids can stay in the same school and still be raised, with the same family values and those kinds of things. But the separation is still very difficult on all of them. But the interesting thing is 75% of the military families report that the first 3 months after the soldier has come home can be the most stressful period in the deployment process. And that, of course, is about adjustment and, slipping back into roles, because the family has to adjust to the absence of the deployed individual. And so there's sometimes some difficulty in shifting back into those old roles as they used to be before, as well as particularly for those veterans returning from combat zones, emotional issues associated with getting accustomed to living in a quote unquote normal environment once again. Now we spend a little bit of time looking at economic and cultural diversity, and really three factors here, which is economic diversity, cultural diversity, and immigration status. First, with economic diversity, the gap between the richest and the poorest Americans has once again been growing since 1970. If you ever read The Jungle, which my students do in social welfare, that was from the early 1900s, and there was such a dramatic differences between the rich and the poor in those days. And this era right now that we're living in is not unlike that at all. Not unlike it at all. And with all the social unrest that occurred during that period of time, one thing, at least historically speaking, the progressive era began to employ, was used and began to employ social programs. We actually had progress after that period of time, and so there is some hope, if you take a historical perspective, that we will once again return to a more socially progressive outlook in our nation. Two models look at the connection between economics and family functioning. One is the family economic stress model, which says, as you can see here, hardship leads to pressure, which leads to parental distress, disrupted family relationships, leading to child and adolescent adjustment problems. And I'm sure you can add some more things onto the end of that. So that's the economic stress model, looking at the impact of that, and perhaps in looking at that model, you can use that to try to figure out where the family is and where to intervene, what maybe can be done to alter the negative dominoes that occur in this particular model. The family investment model kind of looks at the opposite side, which says that there are families that have the greater resources, have the ability to invest more in the development of their children. As far as cultural diversity is concerned, the cultures around the world and that come to the United States, the cultural groups really differ in how they define family, how they organize family life, and in how they practice customs, traditions, and communication patterns. I mean, every culture has differences, and it's something, as we enter into a home, we need to keep in mind that we tend to I'm speaking as a white middle class Euro-American male who grew up in a two-bio parent home. That's the standard that tends to be used when we kind of evaluate. And even if you're not one of us, I mean, if you're American, that is the standard that is used to evaluate other cultures. That is really very ethnocentric, and so we tend to see minorities as deviant or deficient, when in fact there's nothing about it at all. They're just not, they don't fit into the way that middle class two bio parent Euro American families think they should. That doesn't mean that they're deviant. It means that their traditional patterns are different. So, and the author it's interesting. She says that cultural competence is a tall order, and with all of the different cultures that we encounter in our work, to expect ourselves to be culturally competent perhaps is not realistic. And so she talks about cultural sensitivity, which I think is a good way of seeing this, that we should be curious and open-minded. We know we don't know everything, and be informed, the informed not knowing. And that means when you enter into cultural situations you're not familiar with, you ask a lot of questions, and you once you've been able to establish some measure of trust with your client, and listen closely to what the client's view is on things, and understand that you have limitations in your own understanding because of your own cultural perspective, whatever that may be. That you have respect for the integrity of all other cultures, that you learn as much as you can about these culturally variant families, and also remembering, and this is an important point, that there are as many variations as there may be between cultures. There are always variations within each cultural group that really, are very similar to the variations within our own group. Economics, education level, whether individuals are documented or not documented as immigrants, religion, social class, all those kinds of things. I've taught diversity courses off and on over the years. That's one of those classes where every time I taught it, I grew as an individual, I think. And one of the things that the text talked about was, for instance, with Japanese Americans, that the experiences of Japanese Americans or any Asian Americans, for whatever, who came to America, say 50, 60 years ago, is very different from today. And knowing when the family immigrated can tell you a lot about the family history, because there are great differences in the experiences of immigrating Asian Americans today as opposed to 50 or 60 years ago, or even 100 years ago, whatever it was that they began again. So really get a sense of what the immigration history is, and understand, kind of work to learn what the experiences were of the group in that time in our history when they came to America. It will help you understand the family a lot. And speaking of immigrants, about 40.5 million immigrants live in the United States, about 13% of our population. And they come to us for economic reasons. They come to us because other family members are here. They come to us as refugees. Now, this is a very controversial topic in politics today, and it seems a shame to me that it is. But sadly, that's a period of our history that we're in right now. And again, I being a history nut, an American history nut in particular, I try to take the long view in this and understand that this is a period in our history. It is not who we are. And there have been other periods similar to this in our history about other groups of immigrants. And so we moved past that. Those immigrants have been brought into our society for better or worse, and we'll do it again. I just believe that. But at the present time, it's a very difficult period. And where individuals come from, of course, their country of origin varies across time. And sometimes it's not only what's going on in those countries, but it's our nation's immigration policies that determine when people come in and where they come from. The experiences of first generation immigrants are different from the second and different from the third. And again, as I mentioned in a previous slide, when immigration occurred, has a large impact upon the immigrant as well. Not only just the first generation, but also in the messages about the culture that are handed down through the generations. First generation immigrants tend to hold on to the old culture much more closely than does the second generation. And this could lead to a lot of conflict between the first and second generation. Likewise, the third generation tends to be, if not totally, almost totally associated with the receiving culture. So in the case of immigrants to the United States, the third generation tends to see themselves fully as Americans much more than perhaps the second, and certainly more than the first generation. And so the differences in how they're integrated and assimilated into the dominant culture varies from generation to generation, and again can be the source of a lot of conflict, a lot of misunderstandings among immigrant families. That's something that's very worth knowing as you work with immigrant families. Families that move in sequentially, it's a little bit like military families. The roles have to keep adjusting. It's another thing that I think is important in understanding. The negative term that's being used now is chain migration. I just hate that term, and I think it's a sad state that we hear that being used by our leaders. And children, I have seen children that have been left behind in the process of of emigration or whatever, and or in we had some kids that were we had to place in foster care because the parents were deported a couple of times, and really you know very poorly handled by the immigration service as far as we were concerned, because there was no warning, and it had to be an emergency when it might have been able to have been dealt with differently. But in any event, those children, when they do are finally able to, and it's not without difficulty, believe me, that they're able finally to join their biological family, may have quite a bit of difficulty in reattaching. Another factor about the generations, is that the children tend to learn the language faster. They tend to learn the cultural customs faster, and so a lot of times they wind up in sort of a role reversal to become the cultural interpreter, sometimes literally the interpreter for their parents, and that can upend, particularly in cultures where there's a lot of emphasis upon respect for the elderly, and that kind of thing can really upend the family hierarchy quite a bit. Families from collectivist cultures, this is the ones that emphasize the family and community rather than the individual, have a difficult time when they come to America because we have such an individualistic cultural preference here. I mean, where we raise our kids to move out and to be strong individuals, and that's not the case in many cultures. Again, collectivist cultures tend to be more associated with agrarian, less developed cultures than individualistic cultures do, which tend to be more associated with industrialized cultures. A few slides on challenges to family life, and then we'll wrap this up. Family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, however you want to, spousal abuse, however you want to look at it. There are the figures. It's about in 1 year, I'm sure this is, about 750,000 women and somewhere over 100,000 men in the United States were victims of intimate partner violence. Now, without getting into the politics of this, because it's a long discussion, but the women's movement and the shelter movement, really, while acknowledging perhaps that men are abused by their intimate female partners, believe that that this is an attempt on the part of patriarchal society to undermine the very serious problem that women have in their intimate relationships. And that's based upon a number of things, including the fact that economically speaking, men can leave a relationship a lot more easily than women can. It's based upon the fact that when men abuse women, they tend to do more harm to that woman than a woman does to a man when a woman strikes a man. Those kinds of things, and that really they feel very strongly, and I have to agree with this, that domestic violence intimate partner violence is really a woman problem. It's a female problem. It isn't equally shared by the sexes. Now, that's not to say, however, that you don't have male victims of domestic violence, because you do from time to time, but the dynamics of those relationships are different, and I think the solution to the issue is also very different. In child maltreatment, the text points out, I think correctly, that children are even more vulnerable within a family to violence than the adults are. I mean, not only may you have an abusing parent, but if you've got an abused spouse, that abused spouse is struggling with, I'm going to say, her own difficulties in separating, and has difficulty standing up to the male because of the potential for abuse herself, and so it really doesn't always offer protection for the child. So the child becomes very vulnerable, and not only are children abused by parents, but also by siblings. And in fact, I think most sources will tell you that the rate of child abuse by siblings is higher than by either parent. And we say, well, boys will be boys. The older brother kind of kicked the younger brother around, whatever. It's abuse. In 2012, an estimated 9.2 per 1,000 children were judged to be victims of child maltreatment by parents or other caregivers. That doesn't include sibling abuse. In Alaska, it's interesting. We were not supposed to substantiate physical abuse by siblings. Sexual abuse, yes, but not physical abuse. And elder abuse, 1 in 10 adults older than age 60 have reported emotional, physical, or sexual maltreatment or neglect during the past year as well. Our culture, it doesn't accept violence as including a way of settling disputes. It enshrines violence in its love of football and hockey and boxing and shooting and all sorts of things. Look at the movies that we watch. Look at the video games that children play. And I'm not somebody who thinks we should wipe out all that stuff, but we need to acknowledge the fact that we worship violence. And because of that, there's going to continue to be violence in intimate relationships. Traditional gender socialization favors aggression for masculinity and passivity for femininity. And stress, isolation, intergenerational modeling, also, and there's other factors as well, all increase the risk of violence in a family. Removal is imperative when violence is escalating, although, domestic violence people will tell you that a woman's domestic violence victim's chances of being murdered by her spouse increase by 75% when she leaves the relationship. And DV victims have a sense they know this, and that's one of the reasons they stay. That's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And the text talks about mutual violence between couples, and you're not going to see that often. You do occasionally. I think it's a little bit overstated here in this text, but I will tell you that it says that couples therapy can be appropriate in cases of mutual violence, but I want to tell you that most of the knowledge out in the field in this says that couples therapy is counterindicated in the cases of domestic violence. And the reason for that is because, you're, as a therapist, you're going to encourage the victim to speak up, and again I'm going to say her, voice her feelings and share her thoughts about the violence and act as an equal in a relationship where she clearly is not an equal when she's not in your office with her husband. And so what happens a lot of times after those kinds of sessions is the woman goes home and gets the crap kicked out of her by the abusive spouse. Before couples therapy, the domestic violence experts will tell you before couples therapy, the male has to go through batterer's intervention and totally alter the way he sees women and sees himself. And that is not a quick process. It's not going to happen in a couple of weeks. I think most batterer's intervention programs are at least a year, and that's with steady progression. So just a caveat about this, I don't agree with, at least I understand that the author's talking about mutual violence. I'm still not sure that's indicated, and I just want to point out to you that really think very carefully about couples therapy, if at all, in domestic violence situations. I really wouldn't recommend it. Clearly, more study is needed in this area. Divorce. The probability lifetime of a divorce in the United States still approaches 50%, but it seems to be getting lower according to the text. Second and third marriages are more likely to end in divorce than first marriages. The traditional wisdom is that when a person remarries, which happens, I think, within 2 years, I think it is for men, maybe 3, there's a remarriage. Typically speaking, if that individual who's entering into a new relationship hasn't acknowledged his or her role in the breakup of the first marriage, the traditional wisdom is they're going to wind up doing the same thing in the second marriage. And in the third marriage. So it doesn't surprise me that second and third marriages have a higher rate of divorce, because the fact is that a lot of us leave unhappy relationships blaming the spouse and not really recognizing, owning up to our own role in the dissolution of the relationship. Consequences of the divorce is, it's probably a class in and of itself, both for the spouses, the adults, as well as for the children. And there is some controversy about how long-lasting and serious those consequences need to be. But there is consistent evidence that shows that, particularly that the economic well-being of women and children declines after a divorce. Now, you'll see studies that show that men initially have a large hit to their economics. It has to do with, I think, paying for an attorney and also child support and all that kind of stuff. But very quickly after that's resolved, their financial situation, their economic stability returns to a normal level, maybe even better. Women and children stay at a lower level over a longer period of time than men after divorce. This says the emotional stress level, however, following divorce typically begins to subside within a year after divorce, as individuals learn how to deal with the consequences and adjust to the changes in relationships. And finally, if children are going to have a better adjustment if they have a good relationship with at least one parent, and as I mentioned earlier, if both parents allow that child to have love and affection for the other parent as well, and do not use the child as a sort of a little investigator what's going on in the other home, reporting back and forth or communicating through that child. Those are things that the parents have to know will harm the child, and learn other ways to deal with their difficulties. So, substance abuse, yes. The serious and persistent problem with alcohol or other substances. Alcohol abuse is an adverse effect on marital satisfaction, and I think just not alcohol abuse, and stability, especially among couples where one partner is abusing alcohol and the other partner is not. There is a strong association between excessive alcohol consumption and intimate partner violence, but substance abuse is not a cause of intimate personal violence, intimate partner violence. I'm sorry. Sometimes abusers would tell you, well, I was really drunk and that's why I did it. That's not true. People don't abuse. Lots of people get drunk and they don't become abusive. And so alcohol or other drugs is not the reason for the abuse. It may be a contributing factor. It lowers inhibitions, yes, but it's not the cause of the abuse. And so what you'll see a lot of times with abusers who drink is maybe their spouse leaves a relationship and goes to a shelter, and the first thing the abuser does is go into an alcohol treatment program and comes out and say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. That doesn't work. It doesn't work. So just for your future reference, I raise an eyebrow. Yes, there's an association, but don't confuse that correlation with cause. And I'm also going to say here, this is one of my soapboxes, but goodness gracious, I mean, we have done such a poor job in our society of dealing with alcohol and the effects of that intoxicant. And what are we doing now? But all over the nation now we're beginning to legalize recreational marijuana. And I understand that marijuana, there's different kinds of things that go on with the body as opposed to alcohol, different results perhaps of marijuana. There's still a lot of study that needs to be done. There's also a lot of denial about the impact of marijuana upon individual functioning and upon the relationships in one's life and one's ability to function appropriately in society. And so I just think, we're taking a step backwards as we begin to legalize yet another intoxicant for us to abuse and not handle appropriately. So, okay, I'll come down off my soapbox. I'm sorry if you don't agree with me about that, but that's where I stand on that. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences ACE study. done by Kaiser Permanente, and it was a survey by this insurance company, health insurance company, of thousands of adults. Now, mind you, these adults were fully functioning adults. They have health insurance through their employer, so they're working. They're, outwardly they're adjusting, and yet they have all these biological problems. Some of them have emotional problems and things like this, but they're doing well enough to function and keep a job. And I don't have the immediate results. I have this here somewhere of that study, but it showed that the things that happen to us in our childhood, those adverse experiences, continue to affect us well into our adult years, not just emotionally, but also physically. We somaticize a lot of that. And one of the adverse experiences in a study was alcohol abuse by one or both parents. So implications for social work practice. Assess your families with a variety of theoretical perspectives. Particularly in regards to current economics, be aware of the impact of changes in the larger systems on families' resources and functioning and how that has affected them. Recognize the diversity in family structures, know a little bit about their ethnic background and how that may be played out today. Look for strengths and weaknesses of those family structures. Be aware of the economic diversity and how all of those factors impact families. Be aware of the cultural differences among your families, and try to develop a culturally sensitive practice approach that involves learning both about and from families that are different from your own. Talk to those families. Use appropriate family assessment tools like the Genogram or the Timeline or the Ecom app to help families understand what's going on. They can be very good tools sometimes, especially for some people who are visual learners. When people are dealing with crises, help them find their strengths and give them credit for struggling well. I like that term. Look at the changes in policies that are going on in the state and national levels and see how they impact your work and your ability to do your job, as well as the families. And be ready to advocate if you need to. And particularly in the present day and age is a good example of this. Low income, stressed families are the ones who are going to pay the most in times of economic crisis. Get your families engaged with the systems outside of their own for positive change, and also pay attention to what's going on with your agency's policies and get your agency engaged in advocacy work whenever possible on behalf of families. Okay, that's enough. It was a rather long lecture and it was a little longer than I thought it would be, but I think this is an interesting topic, and I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know if there's any questions that come up, and I'll be talking with you again.